In the humid darkness of a tropical night, somewhere deep in the rainforests of what we now call Guatemala, a young scribe dips his brush into black ink made from soot and tree resin. By the flickering light of a pine torch, he carefully draws glyphs onto bark paper, recording the movements of Venus across the star-scattered sky. The year, by our reckoning, is 682 of the Common Era, though he would measure time differently, counting the days since the world began, on a date that corresponds to August 11th, 3114 BCE. He does not know that 15 centuries later, scholars will struggle to decipher his elegant script, marveling at the mathematical precision hidden within these ancient symbols. He knows only that the stars must be tracked, the calendar must be maintained, and the sacred count of days must continue unbroken, as it has for over 3,000 years. The story of the Maya begins not with grand proclamations or the clash of armies, but with this quiet devotion to time itself. Long before Rome was built, before the pyramids of Egypt were conceived, the ancestors of this scribe were already watching the heavens, developing a calendar more accurate than any the world had yet seen. They were learning to read the subtle language of the seasons, to predict eclipses with stunning precision, and to weave together mathematics, astronomy, and mythology into a worldview of breathtaking complexity. But let us begin at the very beginning, in that misty realm where history blends with legend, where the first footsteps of human beings echo across the landscapes of Mesoamerica. According to Maya creation mythology, recorded in their sacred book called the Popol Vuh, the gods attempted several times to create human beings. First they tried mud, but these creatures dissolved in the rain. Then they carved people from wood, but these beings had no souls and were destroyed by a great flood. Finally, the gods ground yellow and white corn into flour, mixed it with water, and shaped the first true humans, who were blessed with intelligence and the ability to speak. This creation story, beautiful in its imagery, reflects a profound truth about Maya civilization. It was built upon maize. The cultivation of corn, along with beans and squash, formed the agricultural foundation that would support millions of people across an area larger than modern Germany. But the real beginnings of Maya civilization stretch back to around 2000 BCE, during what archaeologists call the Archaic period, when small bands of hunter-gatherers began to settle in villages throughout the Maya region. The land they chose was both blessing and challenge. The Maya lowlands of northern Guatemala, Belize, and the Yucatan Peninsula were covered in dense tropical rainforest, where jaguars padded silently through the undergrowth and brilliantly colored quetzal birds flashed like jewels through the canopy. Rivers meandered lazily through the landscape, but much of the water supply came from underground rivers and natural sinkholes called cenotes, which the Maya considered sacred portals to the underworld. To the south, the landscape rose into the volcanic highlands of Guatemala and Chiapas, where mist-shrouded mountains provided rich volcanic soil and cooler temperatures. Along the Pacific coast stretched fertile plains ideal for cacao cultivation, while the Caribbean coast offered access to marine resources and trade routes that would eventually connect Maya merchants with civilizations as far away as central Mexico. The earliest Maya villages were small affairs, clusters of thatched houses built around central plazas where the community would gather for ceremonies and markets. The houses themselves were remarkably similar to those still built by Maya people today, rectangular structures with walls of wooden poles plastered with mud, topped by steep pitched roofs of palm thatch that could shed the torrential rains of the wet season. Inside, families would sleep in hammocks, cook over small fires, and store their precious corn in large ceramic jars. During these early centuries, from roughly 2000 to 250 CE, in what archaeologists term the pre-classic period, Maya society began to take on the characteristics that would define it for the next 2 millennia. Villages grew into towns, and towns began to compete with one another for resources and prestige. Leaders emerged, distinguished perhaps initially by their skill in warfare, their knowledge of ritual, or their ability to organize community projects like the construction of raised fields in swampy areas, or the building of reservoirs to store water during the dry season. The first monumental architecture appeared during this time. Great platforms and pyramids built not by slaves driven by whips, as popular imagination might suggest, but by communities working together during the agricultural off-season. These early pyramids were modest affairs compared to the soaring temples that would come later, but they represented something revolutionary: the ability of Maya society to mobilize surplus labor for projects that served not immediate survival needs, but rather the spiritual and political requirements of an increasingly complex civilization. One of the most remarkable early sites was El Mirador, located deep in the rainforests of northern Guatemala. Between 600 and 100 BCE, El Mirador grew to become perhaps the largest city in the pre-Columbian Americas, with a population that may have reached 100,000 people. The site featured massive pyramids, including the Danta complex, which covers more ground than the Great Pyramid of Giza and rises nearly as high. Connected to El Mirador by raised stone causeways called Sacbiob were dozens of smaller sites, creating what may have been the world's first urban network. But El Mirador's glory was not to last. Around 100 CE, the great city was largely abandoned, its pyramids slowly being reclaimed by the jungle. The reasons for this collapse remain mysterious. Perhaps the intensive agriculture needed to support such a large population had exhausted the soil. Perhaps political upheavals or warfare disrupted the delicate networks of trade and tribute that sustained the city. Or perhaps climate change, in the form of prolonged droughts, made the region uninhabitable for such a large population. Whatever the cause, El Mirador's fall marked the end of one chapter in Maya history and the beginning of another. As the great pre-classic centers declined, new cities began to rise throughout the Maya world. This marked the beginning of what archaeologists call the Classic Period, roughly 250 to 900 CE, when Maya civilization would reach its greatest heights of achievement in art, architecture, mathematics, astronomy, and writing. The transition to the Classic Period was marked by several crucial developments. First was the widespread adoption of a sophisticated writing system, consisting of hundreds of hieroglyphic signs that could represent both sounds and entire concepts. This system, which scholars have only recently learned to read with confidence, allowed the Maya to record their history, their religious beliefs, their astronomical observations, and their political propaganda in unprecedented detail. Second was the development of what archaeologists call the divine kingship system. Maya rulers were not merely political leaders, but were considered to be living gods, intermediaries between the human world and the realm of deities and ancestors. They performed bloodletting rituals to nourish the gods, conducted elaborate ceremonies to ensure the continuation of time itself, and waged wars not merely for territory or resources, but to capture high-ranking enemies who could be sacrificed in spectacular public rituals. Third was the flowering of Maya art and architecture. Classic period Maya cities were adorned with temples that seemed to reach toward the heavens, palaces decorated with intricate sculptural programs, and a ball courts where a mysterious rubber ball game was played with deep religious significance. The Maya developed a distinctive architectural style featuring corbelled arches, steep-sided pyramids topped by temple structures, and elaborate roof combs that rose like stone crowns above the jungle canopy. The greatest of these classic period cities was Tikal, located in what is now northern Guatemala. Rising from the forest floor like stone mountains, Tikal's pyramids could be seen from miles away, their summits crowned with temples where priests conducted the rituals that maintained the cosmic order. At its height between 300 and 600 CE, Tikal was home to perhaps 60,000 people, making it one of the largest cities in the world at that time. Tikal's rise to prominence was largely due to its strategic location along important trade routes and its aggressive military policies under a series of powerful rulers. The first of these great kings was Yax-Erb-Suk, who founded Tikal's ruling dynasty around 90 CE. But it was under the rule of Jasar Chankawale in the late 7th and early 8th centuries that Tikal reached its greatest power, controlling a territory that stretched across much of the central Maya lowlands. Jasar Chankawale was both a skilled military commander and a patron of the arts. Under his rule, Tikal's artisans created some of the finest examples of Maya sculpture and painting, including the elaborate tomb paintings that decorated his own burial chamber deep within Temple 1, a massive pyramid that still dominates Tikal's skyline today. When he died in 734 CE, his successor built an even grander tomb for him, Temple 2, creating an architectural dialogue between the two structures that has enchanted visitors for over 1,000 years. But Tikal was not alone in its grandeur. Across the Maya world, dozens of other cities were rising to compete for trade, territory, and prestige. To the north, in the Yucatan Peninsula, the city of Coba grew to control a network of stone causeways that connected dozens of smaller settlements. To the west, Palenque became famous for the elegance of its architecture and the sophistication of its sculptural programs, particularly during the reign of Kinich Janab Pakal, who ruled for an astonishing 68 years from 615 to 683 CE. Pakal's reign at Palenque represents one of the high points of Maya civilization. Born into a dynasty that traced its lineage back to mythical times, Pakal came to the throne as a young boy and gradually built Palenque into one of the most beautiful cities in the Maya world. His architects developed a distinctive style characterized by large windows, intricate roof combs, and delicate limestone sculptures that seemed to defy the weight of the stone from which they were carved. Pakal's greatest monument was his own tomb, located deep within the Temple of Inscriptions, a 9-level pyramid that took decades to complete. The tomb chamber itself is a masterpiece of Maya art, featuring elaborately carved walls depicting Pakal's journey through the underworld and his eventual resurrection as a god. The famous sarcophagus lid shows Pakal at the moment of death, falling into the jaws of the earth monster, while simultaneously being reborn as the maize god, the deity who brought agriculture to humanity. The discovery of Pakal's tomb in 1952 by Mexican archaeologist Alberto Ruz Luelier was one of the great moments in the history of archaeology, comparable to Howard Carter's discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb. Unlike the Egyptian pharaohs, however, Pakal was buried with relatively few material goods. Instead, his tomb was filled with symbolic representations of his journey to the afterlife, carved in stone with such precision and artistry that they rival the greatest sculptures of any civilization. While Pakal was building his architectural legacy at Palenque, other Maya cities were engaged in complex webs of alliance, trade, and warfare. The city of Caracol, located in what is now Belize, grew to become one of the largest Maya sites, with a population that may have reached 150,000 people at its height in the 7th century CE. Caracol's success was built on its ability to control agricultural terraces that covered hundreds of square miles of hilly terrain, transforming what had been marginal land into highly productive farmland. Caracol's rulers were also skilled diplomats and military commanders. This victory allowed Caracol to expand its territory and establish itself as one of the dominant powers in the Maya world for over a century. But power in the Maya world was always shifting, and alliances were constantly being forged and broken. Cities that were enemies one generation might be allies the next, bound together by marriage alliances, trade agreements, or shared religious obligations. The Maya developed a complex system of diplomacy that included the exchange of luxury goods, the performance of ritual dances at each other's courts, and the practice of royal marriages that linked ruling dynasties across hundreds of miles. One of the most important of these alliances was between the cities of Copan and Quirigua, located in what are now Honduras and Guatemala respectively. For centuries, Quirigua was subordinate to the larger and more powerful Copan, sending tribute and acknowledging Copan's overlordship. But in 738 CE, Quirigua's ruler, Kiak Tiliu Chan Yopat, captured and sacrificed Copan's king, 18 Rabbit, in a dramatic reversal that shifted the balance of power throughout the southeastern Maya region. This event was commemorated at Quirigua with some of the finest stone sculptures ever created by Maya artisans. The site's stele, tall stone monuments covered with hieroglyphic inscriptions and portraits of rulers are considered masterpieces of Maya art. The largest of these, Stela E, stands over 35 feet tall and weighs 65 tons, making it one of the largest monolithic sculptures ever created in the pre-Columbian Americas. The rivalry between Copan and Quirigua illustrates one of the most important aspects of Maya civilization: its political fragmentation. Unlike the great empires of Egypt, China, or Rome, the Maya world was never united under a single ruler. Instead, it consisted of dozens of independent city-states, each controlling a territory that might extend only a few dozen miles from the urban center. This political fragmentation was both a strength and a weakness. It encouraged innovation and prevented any single ruler from becoming too powerful, but it also made coordinated responses to threats like climate change or foreign invasion nearly impossible. The fragmented nature of Maya political organization becomes particularly apparent when we examine the inscriptions that Maya scribes carved on stone monuments throughout their cities. These inscriptions, written in the complex hieroglyphic script that was only deciphered in the latter half of the 20th century, provide us with detailed accounts of the political history of the classic period. They tell us of wars fought over control of trade routes, of marriage alliances that linked distant kingdoms, of captured enemies sacrificed in elaborate public ceremonies, and of rulers who claimed descent from gods and mythical heroes. Reading these inscriptions is like eavesdropping on conversations that took place over 1,000 years ago. We learn that in 695 CE, the ruler of Dos Pilas captured an enemy lord and kept him prisoner for several years before finally sacrificing him in a ritual that was timed to coincide with an important astronomical event. We discover that the Queen of Naranjo led military campaigns against neighboring cities, commanding armies in person and celebrating her victories with monuments that portray her trampling defeated enemies underfoot. Perhaps most remarkably, these inscriptions reveal that the Maya had developed historical consciousness centuries before similar developments in Europe. Maya scribes recorded not just the deeds of contemporary rulers, but also traced their dynasties back through dozens of generations, sometimes to mythical founders who lived centuries before the founding of their cities. They calculated backwards through time to determine the exact dates when legendary events had occurred, and they projected forward to predict when similar events might happen again. This sophisticated understanding of time was made possible by Maya achievements in mathematics and astronomy that were centuries ahead of their contemporaries elsewhere in the world. The Maya developed the concept of zero independently of the Old World, and they used a sophisticated positional notation system that allowed them to perform complex calculations with large numbers. Their astronomers tracked the movements of Venus with such precision that their calculations were more accurate than those made by European astronomers 1,000 years later. The Maya calendar system was perhaps the most sophisticated timekeeping device ever developed by any civilization. It consisted of multiple interlocking cycles of different lengths, from a 260-day sacred calendar used for religious purposes to a 365-day solar calendar used for agricultural planning. The Maya also maintained a long count, which tracked the number of days that had elapsed since the beginning of the current world age, and they calculated when this age would end and a new one would begin. This mastery of time and number was not merely an intellectual exercise. For the Maya, time was sacred, and each day carried its own spiritual significance. The 260-day sacred calendar was used to determine when ceremonies should be performed, when children should be named, when wars should be fought, and when rulers should be crowned. Maya priests consulted elaborate tables to determine the most auspicious times for important events, and they performed complex rituals to ensure that time itself continued to flow properly. The importance of timekeeping in Maya society is perhaps best illustrated by the Great Observatory at Sultun, a small site in northern Guatemala, where archaeologists have discovered what may be the oldest Maya astronomical tables. Painted on the walls of a small room, these tables track the movements of Mars and Venus over thousands of years, allowing priests to predict when these planets would appear at specific positions in the sky. The calculations involved are staggeringly complex, involving corrections for the slight irregularities in planetary motion that even modern astronomers find challenging to predict. But Maya achievements in mathematics and astronomy were just one aspect of a civilization that excelled in many fields. Maya artists created some of the most sophisticated visual art ever produced in the Americas, from delicate ceramic vessels painted with scenes from mythology to massive stone sculptures that combine portraiture with religious symbolism. Maya architects built cities that harmonized with the natural landscape while simultaneously transforming it, creating urban environments that housed hundreds of thousands of people while maintaining access to clean water, efficient waste disposal, and productive agricultural areas. Perhaps most remarkably, Maya civilization achieved all of this without several technologies that other great civilizations considered essential. The Maya never developed the wheel for transportation, though they did use it for toys. They never domesticated large animals for labor, though they kept dogs, turkeys, and stingless bees. They never developed metallurgy on a large scale, though they did work with gold, silver, and copper for decorative purposes. Instead, Maya civilization was built on the foundation of human labor, sophisticated social organization, and an intellectual tradition that valued knowledge for its own sake. The daily life of ordinary Maya people during the classic period was shaped by the rhythms of agriculture and the demands of urban life. Most Maya lived in small houses on the outskirts of cities, where they grew corn, beans, and squash in small gardens and raised turkeys and dogs for food. During the agricultural off-season, many of these people would have worked on construction projects in the city center, hauling stone for new temples, or creating the elaborate stucco decorations that adorned palace walls. The Maya diet was based primarily on corn, which was prepared in dozens of different ways. Corn kernels were ground into flour for tortillas, fermented into alcoholic beverages, and mixed with water to create nutritious gruels. Beans provided essential protein, while squash contributed vitamins and minerals. The Maya also hunted deer, peccaries, and birds in the surrounding forests, and they raised dogs and turkeys as sources of meat for special occasions. In the cities, skilled artisans created the luxury goods that were traded throughout Mesoamerica. Maya potters developed sophisticated techniques for creating thin-walled vessels decorated with complex painted scenes. Maya sculptors carved jade, obsidian, and stone into objects of remarkable beauty and technical skill. Maya scribes maintained libraries of bark paper books, called codices, which contained astronomical tables, historical records, and religious texts. The most skilled of these artisans enjoyed high status in Maya society. Master potters, sculptors, and scribes were attached to royal courts, where they created the objects that demonstrated their patrons' wealth and power. The finest Maya artwork was created for ceremonial purposes, to be used in the elaborate rituals that maintained the connection between the human world and the realm of the gods. These rituals were conducted in the great plazas and temples that formed the hearts of Maya cities. On important calendar dates, thousands of people would gather to watch as priests and rulers performed complex ceremonies involving music, dancing, the burning of incense, and the sacrifice of blood, food, and captive enemies. The largest of these ceremonies were timed to coincide with astronomical events, like eclipses or the first appearance of Venus as the morning star. Maya religious beliefs were based on a complex mythology that explained the creation of the world, the nature of time, and the relationships between gods, humans, and the natural world. According to Maya cosmology, the universe consisted of multiple levels, from the watery underworld, where the sun traveled at night, to the celestial realm, where the gods resided. The earth itself was conceived as the back of a great crocodile or turtle floating in primordial waters. The Maya pantheon included hundreds of deities, each with specific responsibilities and complex relationships with one another. The most important of these was Itzamna, the creator god who invented writing and established the calendar. The rain god Chak was crucial for agricultural success, while the sun god Kainich Ahau provided the light and warmth necessary for life. The feathered serpent Kukulkan, known to the Aztecs as Quetzalcoatl, was associated with wind, rain, and learning. But Maya religion was not simply a matter of worshipping distant deities. The Maya believed that gods were actively involved in daily life and that human actions could influence divine behavior. Rulers were expected to communicate with the gods through elaborate rituals, including bloodletting ceremonies in which they pierced their tongues, earlobes, or genitals with stingray spines or obsidian blades. The blood was then dripped onto bark paper, which was burned to carry the offering to the gods. These bloodletting rituals were often accompanied by the consumption of hallucinogenic substances, which induced visions that the Maya interpreted as direct communication with deities and ancestors. Priests and rulers would enter trance states during important ceremonies, experiencing visions that provided guidance for important decisions about warfare, agriculture, and political alliances. The most dramatic of Maya religious ceremonies involved the sacrifice of captive enemies, usually high-ranking warriors or nobles captured in battle. These sacrifices were not random acts of violence, but carefully orchestrated rituals that reenacted mythological events and maintained the cosmic order. The timing of these ceremonies was calculated to coincide with important astronomical events, and the methods used were rich with symbolic meaning. One of the most common forms of sacrifice was decapitation, which the Maya associated with the harvest of corn and the cycling of the seasons. Other victims were shot with arrows in rituals that reenacted the death of the maize god, while still others were thrown into cenotes or sacred wells as offerings to the rain god. The most prestigious victims were subjected to elaborate tortures before their eventual death, with each stage of the process carefully choreographed to maximize its religious significance. These practices, shocking to modern sensibilities, were essential components of Maya religious life. The Maya believed that the gods had sacrificed themselves to create the world and to sustain human life, and that humans were obligated to reciprocate through their own sacrificial offerings. Blood was considered the most precious gift that humans could offer to the gods, and the sacrifice of high-ranking enemies was the ultimate expression of devotion and gratitude. The capture of suitable sacrificial victims was one of the primary motivations for Maya warfare, but it was not the only one. Maya cities also fought for control of trade routes, agricultural land, and sources of raw materials like obsidian and jade. Some wars were fought to resolve succession disputes or to punish cities that had failed to provide expected tribute payments. Maya warfare was a highly ritualized activity that followed specific rules and conventions. Wars were typically declared on astronomically significant dates, and battles were often timed to coincide with important calendar cycles. Warriors wore elaborate costumes that identified their rank and allegiance, and they carried weapons and shields decorated with religious symbols that were believed to provide supernatural protection. The most prestigious Maya warriors were members of military orders associated with powerful animals like jaguars and eagles. These elite fighters underwent intensive training in weapons use, battlefield tactics, and the ritual requirements of warfare. They were expected not just to kill enemies, but to capture them alive for later sacrifice, a much more difficult task that required exceptional skill and courage. Maya armies used a variety of weapons, including spears tipped with obsidian points, clubs embedded with sharp stone blades, and bows that shot arrows with deadly accuracy. They also used psychological warfare, decorating their shields and clothing with terrifying images of gods and monsters, and they employed elaborate battle cries and war dances designed to intimidate their enemies before combat began. The outcomes of these wars could reshape the political landscape of entire regions. When Caracol defeated Tikal in 562 CE, it established itself as the dominant power in the central Maya lowlands for over a century. When Quirigua captured and sacrificed Copan's ruler in 738 CE, it broke centuries of tributary relationships and created new opportunities for smaller cities to assert their independence. But warfare was not the only factor that shaped Maya political relationships. Trade was equally important, and Maya merchants traveled throughout Mesoamerica, carrying goods that ranged from basic commodities like salt and obsidian to luxury items like jade jewelry and quetzal feathers. These merchants, called Pochteca, were not just traders, but also diplomats and spies who carried information about political developments, military preparations, and economic opportunities. The most valuable trade goods were often those with religious significance. Jade was more precious than gold to the Maya, who associated its green color with water, vegetation, and life itself. Jade was carved into elaborate ornaments, ceremonial masks, and small sculptures that were placed in royal tombs. The finest jade came from the Motagua Valley in Guatemala, and control of these sources was a constant source of conflict between competing Maya cities. Obsidian, a volcanic glass that could be knapped into razor-sharp blades, was another crucial trade commodity. The best obsidian came from sources in the highlands of Guatemala and Mexico, and Maya craftsmen became extraordinarily skilled at creating tools and weapons from this material. Obsidian blades were so sharp that modern surgeons have experimented with using them for delicate operations, finding that they create cleaner cuts than steel scalpels. Cacao, the source of chocolate, was perhaps the most important agricultural export from the Maya region. Cacao beans were not only processed into beverages that were consumed during religious ceremonies, but also served as a form of currency throughout Mesoamerica. Maya merchants would carry thousands of cacao beans on trading expeditions, using them to purchase everything from cotton textiles to precious stones. The trade in cacao illustrates the sophisticated economic systems that developed during the Classic period. Maya farmers in the fertile river valleys of Tabasco and the Pacific coast of Guatemala specialized in cacao production, developing techniques for intensive cultivation that could support large populations. These cacao-producing regions became wealthy and powerful, able to support elaborate ceremonial centers and large armies. Cotton was another important agricultural export, grown primarily in the drier regions of the Yucatan Peninsula and the highlands of Guatemala. Maya weavers developed sophisticated techniques for creating textiles that were traded throughout Mesoamerica. The finest cotton textiles were decorated with complex patterns created using natural dyes, including the brilliant red obtained from cochineal insects and the deep blue derived from indigo plants. Salt production was controlled by specialized communities along the Caribbean and Pacific coasts, who developed techniques for evaporating seawater in shallow ponds and extracting salt from inland brine springs. Salt was essential, not just for food preparation, but also for food preservation, making it one of the most widely traded commodities in the Maya world. These trade networks connected the Maya region to civilizations throughout Mesoamerica and beyond. Maya merchants traveled as far north as central Mexico, where they established communities in cities like Teotihuacan, and as far south as Costa Rica and Panama. They carried Maya goods to these distant markets and returned with exotic products like gold from Panama, turquoise from the American Southwest, and shell ornaments from the Caribbean. The wealth generated by this extensive trade supported the construction of ever more elaborate ceremonial centers. During the late Classic period, from roughly 600 to 900 CE, Maya architecture reached new heights of sophistication and grandeur. Cities like Tikal, Caracol, and Calakmul built massive pyramids that soared over 200 feet above the jungle floor, their summits crowned with temples decorated with elaborate sculptural programs. The architects of these great temples solved complex engineering problems without the benefit of metal tools, pulleys, or wheeled vehicles. They developed sophisticated techniques for quarrying and moving massive stone blocks, some weighing several tons each. They created mortar from limestone and volcanic ash that has proven more durable than many modern building materials. They designed drainage systems that could handle the torrential rains of the tropical wet season while preserving the structural integrity of their buildings. Perhaps most remarkably, Maya architects learned to create the optical illusions that made their buildings appear even larger and more impressive than they actually were. The pyramids at sites like Chichen Itza and Uxmal were designed with subtle curves and proportional relationships that enhanced their visual impact, creating buildings that seemed to defy gravity and reach toward the heavens. The interiors of these temples were decorated with some of the finest art ever created in the Americas. Maya painters developed sophisticated techniques for creating murals that combined realistic portraiture with complex religious symbolism. The famous murals at Bonampak, discovered in 1946, show scenes of warfare, captive sacrifice, and royal ceremonies painted with such skill and attention to detail that they rank among the masterpieces of world art. Maya sculptors created relief carvings that covered entire building facades with complex narratives about royal dynasties, mythological events, and astronomical observations. The sculptural program at Palenque tells the story of the city's ruling dynasty across multiple generations, while the carvings at Yaxchilan chronicle the military victories and ritual activities of its rulers in extraordinary detail. But perhaps the most impressive aspect of Maya artistic achievement was the integration of different art forms into unified aesthetic experiences. Maya ceremonial centers were designed as total environments where architecture, sculpture, painting, music, dance, and theatre combined to create overwhelming sensory experiences. Important ceremonies would have engaged all of the participants' senses, from the visual impact of elaborately costumed performers to the sound of wooden trumpets, conch shell horns, and ceramic drums. The audiences for these ceremonies included not just the local population, but also visitors from other Maya cities and foreign dignitaries from as far away as central Mexico. These gatherings served multiple purposes. They demonstrated the wealth and power of the host city, they reinforced religious beliefs and social hierarchies, and they provided opportunities for diplomatic negotiations and trade agreements. The largest of these ceremonies could last for several days and involve thousands of participants. The dedication of a new temple or the accession of a new ruler might require months of preparation, with specialists preparing elaborate costumes, training performers, and calculating the precise astronomical timing that would ensure the ceremony's effectiveness. During the height of the Classic period, the Maya world was home to millions of people living in hundreds of cities and towns connected by networks of trade, warfare, and religious obligation. The total population of the Maya region during this time may have approached 5 million people, making it one of the most densely populated areas in the pre-Columbian Americas. This large population was supported by sophisticated agricultural techniques that allowed Maya farmers to extract high yields from tropical soils that European colonists would later consider unsuitable for intensive agriculture. Maya farmers developed systems of raised fields in swampy areas, terraced hillsides to prevent erosion, and forest gardens that mimicked the structure of natural ecosystems while producing food for human consumption. The raised field systems, called chinampas, were particularly ingenious. Maya engineers constructed networks of canals and artificial islands in wetland areas, creating agricultural systems that were simultaneously highly productive and environmentally sustainable. These systems provided not just agricultural land, but also sources of fish, waterfowl, and aquatic plants that added protein and nutrients to the Maya diet. In hilly areas, Maya farmers built elaborate terrace systems that prevented soil erosion while creating level planting surfaces. Some of these terrace systems covered hundreds of square miles and required the coordinated labor of thousands of people to construct and maintain. The terraces were often integrated with sophisticated water management systems that captured rainwater during the wet season and distributed it during times of drought. Maya farmers also developed forest garden systems that took advantage of the natural productivity of tropical forests while providing human food needs. These systems involved the selective planting of useful trees and shrubs in forest clearings, creating productive landscapes that to casual observers might appear to be natural forest, but were actually carefully managed agricultural systems. These agricultural innovations allowed the Maya to support large urban populations in environments that might seem unsuitable for intensive settlement. Cities like Tikal and Caracol were built in areas with no permanent water sources, relying instead on elaborate systems of reservoirs, canals, and cisterns to collect and store rainwater during the wet season. The engineering required for these water management systems was remarkably sophisticated. Maya engineers calculated the volume of runoff from different types of surfaces, designed settling ponds to remove sediments from collected water, and created distribution systems that could supply clean water to different neighborhoods within their cities. Some cities built aqueducts that carried water across valleys, while others created underground cisterns that could store thousands of gallons of water for use during the dry season. These achievements in agriculture and engineering were made possible by Maya advances in mathematics and science. Maya mathematicians developed positional notation systems that allowed them to perform complex calculations with large numbers. Maya astronomers created predictive models for planetary motion that were more accurate than those used in Europe until the Renaissance. Maya physicians developed sophisticated knowledge of human anatomy and created effective treatments for a wide range of medical conditions. Maya knowledge of astronomy was particularly advanced. Maya astronomers tracked not just the movements of the sun and moon, but also the complex cycles of Venus, Mars, and other planets. They calculated the length of the solar year to within minutes of the correct value, and they developed correction factors that kept their calendar accurate over centuries of use. This astronomical knowledge was not merely academic, but had practical applications in agriculture, medicine, and statecraft. Maya farmers used astronomical observations to time their planting and harvesting activities. Maya physicians believed that the positions of celestial bodies influenced human health and timed their treatments accordingly. Maya rulers consulted astronomical tables to determine the most auspicious times for important political decisions. The integration of astronomical knowledge with religious beliefs created a world view in which the movements of celestial bodies were intimately connected with events in the human world. Maya rulers were believed to be incarnations of celestial deities, and their coronations, marriages, and deaths were timed to coincide with significant astronomical events. Wars were often declared when Venus reached specific positions in its cycle, and peace treaties were signed during eclipses or other rare celestial phenomena. This sophisticated integration of science, religion, and politics reached its culmination during the late Classic period, when Maya civilization achieved its greatest territorial extent and cultural influence. From roughly 600 to 900 CE, Maya ideas, artistic styles, and technologies spread throughout Mesoamerica, influencing civilizations from central Mexico to Costa Rica. But even as Maya civilization reached these heights of achievement, forces were building that would lead to its transformation and partial collapse. Climate studies suggest that the Maya region experienced a series of severe droughts during the 8th and 9th centuries CE, disrupting the agricultural systems that supported large urban populations. Political conflicts intensified as cities competed for control of increasingly scarce resources. Archaeological evidence suggests that warfare became more frequent and more destructive during the late Classic period. Cities that had coexisted peacefully for centuries began to attack each other with increasing ferocity. Trade networks that had connected the Maya world for centuries began to break down as political relationships deteriorated. The first signs of trouble appeared in the southern Maya lowlands, where cities like Copan and Quirigua began to experience political instability and population decline. By 800 CE, many of the great ceremonial centers in this region had been abandoned, their pyramids and palaces left to be slowly reclaimed by the advancing jungle. The collapse spread northward like a slow-moving wave of abandonment. Tikal, the greatest of all classic Maya cities, erected its last dated monument in 869 CE. Caracol fell silent around the same time. One by one, the cities that had dominated the Maya world for over 6 centuries ceased to commission new monuments, stopped maintaining their great buildings, and watched their populations disperse into the surrounding countryside. This phenomenon, which archaeologists call the classic Maya collapse, was not a sudden catastrophe, but rather a gradual process that unfolded over more than a century. Different cities experienced decline at different times and for different reasons. But the overall pattern was unmistakable. The great urban centers that had been the heart of Maya civilization were dying. The causes of this collapse have been debated by scholars for decades. Climate change certainly played a role, as tree ring data and lake sediment cores provide clear evidence for a series of severe droughts that struck the Maya region between 760 and 910 CE. These droughts would have been particularly devastating for cities that depended on elaborate water management systems, as reservoirs dried up and agricultural yields plummeted. But climate change alone cannot explain the collapse. The Maya had survived droughts before, and some regions that experienced the same climatic stresses continued to flourish. The collapse appears to have been triggered by the interaction of environmental stress with existing social and political tensions that had been building for centuries. The increasing frequency of warfare during the late Classic period suggests that political relationships among Maya cities had become increasingly unstable. As resources became scarcer due to environmental degradation and climate change, competition for control of trade routes, agricultural land, and sources of tribute intensified. Cities that had maintained peaceful relationships for generations found themselves locked in destructive conflicts that diverted resources from essential activities like agricultural maintenance and water management. The Maya political system, based on the personal authority of divine kings, may have become a liability during this period of crisis. When rulers could no longer deliver military victories, agricultural abundance, or protection from enemies, their legitimacy was undermined. Some cities appear to have experienced civil wars or popular revolts that destroyed the social institutions necessary for maintaining complex urban societies. Population pressure may also have contributed to the collapse. Archaeological surveys suggest that the Maya region was more densely settled during the late Classic period than at any time before or since. This large population was supported by intensive agricultural systems that may have reached their productive limits. When drought reduced agricultural yields, there may simply have been too many people for the available resources to support. The collapse was not uniform across the Maya world. While the southern lowlands experienced devastating urban abandonment, other regions continued to flourish. The northern Yucatan Peninsula, which had been relatively peripheral during the Classic period, emerged as the new center of Maya civilization. Cities like Chichen Itza and Mayapan rose to prominence, developing new forms of political organization and cultural expression that would define the post-Classic period. This transition from the Classic to the post-Classic period, roughly 900 to 1500 CE, marked a fundamental transformation in Maya civilization. The post-Classic Maya world was characterized by greater political centralization, increased long-distance trade, and stronger connections with other Mesoamerican civilizations, particularly those of central Mexico. The most important post-Classic Maya city was Chichen Itza, located in the northern Yucatan Peninsula. Chichen Itza combined traditional Maya architectural and artistic styles with influences from central Mexico, creating a distinctive hybrid culture that reflected the increasingly cosmopolitan nature of Mesoamerican civilization during this period. The Great Pyramid at Chichen Itza, known as El Castillo or the Temple of Kukulkan, demonstrates this cultural synthesis. The pyramid's design incorporates sophisticated astronomical alignments that create shadow effects during the spring and autumn equinoxes, when the shadow of the pyramid's corner creates the illusion of a serpent descending the northern staircase. This effect combines Maya astronomical knowledge with central Mexican religious symbolism, creating a monument that spoke to the shared cultural heritage of Mesoamerican civilization. Chichen Itza's Great Ball Court is the largest of its kind ever built, measuring over 500 feet in length and decorated with elaborate relief sculptures that depict the religious significance of the ball game. The acoustic properties of this court are remarkable. A person speaking at one end can be clearly heard at the other end, over 500 feet away, while a handclap produces multiple echoes that sound like the call of the Quetzal bird. The city's sacred cenote, a natural limestone sinkhole filled with water, served as a pilgrimage destination for people throughout Mesoamerica. Archaeological excavations of the cenote have recovered thousands of offerings, including gold and copper objects from as far away as Colombia and Panama, jade jewelry from Guatemala, and copal incense from throughout Mexico. Human remains found in the cenote provide evidence for the human sacrifices that were conducted there, often involving children and young adults who were thrown into the water during times of drought or other crises. Chichen Itza's influence extended throughout the Maya world and beyond. The city controlled important salt deposits along the northern coast of Yucatan, and its merchants traded throughout Mesoamerica. Chichen Itza's artistic styles influenced communities as far away as El Salvador and Honduras, while its architectural innovations were copied at sites throughout Mexico. But Chichen Itza's dominance was not destined to last. By 1200 CE, the city had begun to decline, possibly due to internal conflicts or challenges from rival centers. Power in the northern Yucatan shifted to Mayapan, a smaller but more centrally organized city that established the first true Maya state since the collapse of the Classic period centers. Mayapan was surrounded by a massive stone wall that enclosed an area of over 2 square miles. Unlike the dispersed settlement pattern of Classic period cities, Mayapan concentrated its population within this defensive perimeter, creating a more compact urban environment. The city's rulers established a confederacy that brought most of the northern Yucatan under unified control for the first time in Maya history. This political centralization was accompanied by changes in Maya religious practices and social organization. Post-classic Maya cities were more militaristic than their classic period predecessors, with warrior societies playing increasingly important roles in political life. The cult of the feathered serpent, known to the Maya as Kukulkan and to the Aztecs as Quetzalcoatl, became increasingly prominent, reflecting the growing influence of Central Mexican religious ideas. Trade became even more important during the post-classic period than it had been during the classic. Maya merchants, organized into hereditary guilds, traveled throughout Mesoamerica and beyond, establishing trading posts and colonies in distant lands. These merchants were not just traders, but also diplomats, spies, and cultural ambassadors who facilitated the exchange of ideas as well as goods. The most important trading network connected the Maya region with the Aztec Empire of central Mexico. Maya merchants carried cacao, cotton textiles, jade, and quetzal feathers to the great markets of Tenochtitlan, while Aztec traders brought obsidian, metal goods, and exotic products from throughout their empire to Maya cities. This trade relationship was so important that both the Maya and the Aztecs maintained permanent ambassadors at each other's courts. Maya traders also established connections with societies in South America, traveling by sea along the Caribbean and Pacific coasts to reach Colombia, Panama, and Ecuador. They brought back gold, silver, emeralds, and other precious materials that were incorporated into Maya religious and artistic traditions. Some scholars believe that Maya traders may have reached as far south as Peru, though definitive evidence for such long-distance voyages remains elusive. The expansion of trade networks during the post-classic period was facilitated by innovations in transportation and navigation. Maya merchants developed large sea-going canoes that could carry several tons of cargo and dozens of passengers. These vessels were capable of coastal voyages of hundreds of miles, and Maya navigators developed sophisticated knowledge of currents, winds, and seasonal weather patterns that allowed them to undertake dangerous journeys across open water. On land, Maya traders organized large caravans that could transport goods across hundreds of miles of difficult terrain. These caravans were protected by professional warriors and were often sponsored by rulers who took a percentage of the profits in exchange for providing security and diplomatic support. The most successful merchants became wealthy and influential figures in Maya society, sometimes achieving social status comparable to that of nobles. The wealth generated by this expanded trade supported a renaissance in Maya art and learning during the later post-classic period. Cities like Tulum, perched on cliffs overlooking the Caribbean Sea, became centers of artistic production and religious pilgrimage. Tulum's temples were decorated with murals that combined traditional Maya themes with influences from throughout Mesoamerica, creating a distinctive artistic style that reflected the cosmopolitan nature of post-classic Maya culture. Maya scribes during this period compiled new versions of their sacred books, incorporating historical traditions, astronomical observations, and religious teachings that had been preserved through the collapse of the classic period. These books, written on bark paper and bound between wooden covers, contain the accumulated wisdom of Maya civilization spanning over 2 millennia. The most famous of these books is the Popol Vuh, the sacred book of the Quiche Maya of highland Guatemala. The Popol Vuh tells the story of the creation of the world, the adventures of the hero twins who defeated the lords of the underworld, and the origins of corn and human beings. This remarkable text, which was later transcribed into the Latin alphabet by Maya scribes trained by Spanish missionaries, preserves mythological traditions that may date back to the earliest periods of Maya civilization. Other Maya books contained detailed astronomical tables, medical texts, historical chronicles, and prophetic literature that predicted future events based on cyclical patterns in the Maya calendar. These books were treasured possessions of Maya nobles and priests, who consulted them for guidance in important decisions and passed them down through generations as family heirlooms. The preservation of Maya intellectual traditions through the upheavals of the post-classic period demonstrates the resilience and adaptability of Maya culture. Despite the collapse of the great classic period cities, despite centuries of warfare and political instability, despite the growing influence of foreign ideas and practices, the essential core of Maya civilization remained intact. This cultural continuity is perhaps most clearly visible in the persistence of Maya religious beliefs and practices. Throughout the post-classic period, Maya communities continued to worship the same gods, consult the same calendar systems, and perform many of the same rituals that their ancestors had practiced centuries earlier. The feathered serpent Kukulkan became increasingly important, but he was incorporated into traditional Maya religious frameworks rather than replacing older deities. Maya farmers continued to plant corn, beans, and squash, using agricultural techniques that had been developed during the pre-classic period. They continued to live in houses built according to traditional designs, to organize their communities around central plazas where markets and ceremonies were held, and to measure time according to calendar systems that had been in use for over 2 millennia. But the Maya world of the late post-classic period was also characterized by increasing diversity and regionalization. Different areas developed distinctive cultural traditions that reflected their particular histories, environments, and external contacts. The Quiche and Cachiquel kingdoms of highland Guatemala maintained traditions that were quite different from those of the coastal traders of Yucatan, who in turn differed from the forest-dwelling communities of Belize and the Patán. This cultural diversity was both a strength and a weakness when the Maya world was confronted with the arrival of European explorers and conquerors in the early 16th century. The lack of political unity made coordinated resistance to European invasion impossible, as Spanish conquistadors were able to exploit rivalries between different Maya groups. But the diversity of Maya communities also meant that Spanish attempts to impose cultural uniformity were never completely successful. The first Europeans to encounter Maya civilization were Spanish explorers who reached the Yucatan Peninsula in 1511. These early contacts were brief and often hostile, as Maya communities defended themselves against what they perceived as foreign invaders. But the arrival of these strangers from across the sea had been predicted in Maya prophetic literature, which described the coming of bearded men from the east who would bring great changes to the Maya world. The Spanish conquest of the Maya region was a long and difficult process that took over 150 years to complete. Unlike the rapid conquests of the Aztec and Inca empires, the Spanish found the Maya region difficult to control due to its political fragmentation, difficult terrain, and the fierce resistance of many Maya communities. The conquest began in earnest in the 1520s, when Spanish forces under Francisco Hernández de Córdoba and Hernando Cortés established footholds along the Caribbean coast of Yucatan. These early expeditions encountered sophisticated Maya cities with populations in the tens of thousands, impressive stone architecture, and complex political organizations that the Spanish compared to the city-states of medieval Italy. The Maya response to Spanish invasion varied considerably from community to community. Some Maya rulers attempted to form alliances with the Spanish, hoping to use European military technology and political support to gain advantages over traditional enemies. Others organized fierce resistance movements that utilized guerrilla warfare tactics perfectly adapted to the jungle environment. The Quiche kingdom of highland Guatemala initially attempted to resist Spanish invasion through conventional warfare, meeting the conquistadors in open battle with armies numbering in the thousands. But Spanish advantages in military technology, particularly firearms, steel weapons, and cavalry, proved decisive. The Quiche capital of Cumarcaj was captured and burned in 1524, and the last independent Quiche ruler, Tecunuman, was killed in battle against Spanish forces led by Pedro de Alvarado. Other Maya communities adopted different strategies for dealing with the Spanish invasion. Some communities retreated deep into the jungle, establishing hidden settlements that could avoid Spanish control for decades or even centuries. The Itza Maya of the Petén region of Guatemala maintained their independence until 1697, when their capital city of Tayasal was finally captured by Spanish forces after months of siege. The Spanish conquest brought devastating changes to Maya society. European diseases, particularly smallpox, typhus, and measles, caused massive population decline among Maya communities that had no immunity to these ailments. Archaeological evidence suggests that the Maya population may have declined by as much as 90% during the first century after European contact, transforming a landscape that had supported millions of people into what Spanish colonists described as an empty wilderness. The surviving Maya population was subjected to a colonial system that attempted to transform every aspect of their lives. Spanish missionaries worked to convert Maya people to Christianity, often destroying Maya books and religious artifacts that they considered idolatrous. Maya children were separated from their families and placed in mission schools where they were forbidden to speak their native languages or practice traditional customs. Spanish colonial administrators reorganized Maya communities according to European models, forcing scattered populations to concentrate in new towns built around central plazas, dominated by Christian churches. Maya nobles were stripped of their traditional authority and replaced by Spanish officials or Maya collaborators who were willing to implement colonial policies. But despite these massive disruptions, Maya communities showed remarkable resilience in preserving essential aspects of their culture. Maya people continued to speak their native languages, though they also learned Spanish when necessary for dealing with colonial authorities. They continued to grow corn, beans, and squash using traditional agricultural techniques, though they also adopted European crops and domestic animals when these proved useful. Maya religious beliefs were particularly persistent, though they were often disguised or syncretized with Christian symbols and practices. Maya people learned to worship Christian saints, but they often identified these saints with traditional Maya deities who had similar attributes or responsibilities. The Virgin of Guadalupe, for example, was often associated with Maya moon goddesses, while various Catholic saints were identified with rain gods, corn deities, and other traditional figures from Maya mythology. Maya calendar systems continued to be used alongside the European calendar, particularly for agricultural and ceremonial purposes. Maya priests, working in secret or under the guise of Christian lay leadership, maintained the sacred count of days that had been preserved for over 3 millennia. They continued to calculate the optimal times for planting and harvesting, for conducting life cycle ceremonies, and for community festivals that maintained social cohesion. The survival of Maya intellectual traditions during the colonial period was facilitated by the development of Maya literacy in the Latin alphabet. Spanish missionaries, hoping to facilitate religious conversion, taught Maya people to read and write their own languages using European letters. This inadvertently provided Maya communities with new tools for preserving their cultural heritage. Maya scribes used this new writing system to create fresh versions of traditional texts, translating ancient books into the Latin alphabet and adding new material based on oral traditions. The Popol Vuh was preserved in this way, as were numerous other texts dealing with history, astronomy, medicine, and religious practice. These colonial period Maya texts provide invaluable insights into pre-Columbian Maya civilization and demonstrate the continuity of Maya intellectual traditions across centuries of cultural disruption. Maya communities also preserved their cultural heritage through oral traditions that were passed from generation to generation. Traditional stories, songs, and ceremonial speeches maintained knowledge of Maya history, mythology, and ritual practice, even when written records were destroyed or lost. These oral traditions were often encoded in seemingly innocent forms, such as children's games, folk tales, and agricultural songs that could be transmitted without attracting the attention of colonial authorities. The persistence of Maya culture during the colonial period was not just a matter of preserving ancient traditions. Maya communities also demonstrated remarkable creativity in adapting to changing circumstances while maintaining their essential identity. They developed new forms of religious expression that combined Christian and Maya elements in innovative ways. They created new artistic styles that incorporated European techniques and materials while maintaining distinctively Maya aesthetic sensibilities. Maya communities also developed new forms of political organization that allowed them to maintain some degree of autonomy within the colonial system. Many Maya towns were governed by councils of elders who made decisions according to traditional consensus-building practices, even though these councils operated under the nominal authority of Spanish colonial officials. Maya people learned to navigate the complex bureaucracies of colonial administration while maintaining their own internal systems of justice and social control. The colonial period also saw the emergence of new forms of Maya identity that transcended the city-state loyalties of the pre-Columbian period. Shared experiences of conquest, disease, and cultural suppression created bonds of solidarity among Maya communities that had previously been enemies or strangers. A broader sense of Maya identity began to emerge, based not just on shared language and culture, but also on common experiences of resistance to foreign domination. This emerging Maya identity would become increasingly important during the 18th and 19th centuries as colonial control began to weaken and Maya communities found new opportunities to assert their rights and interests. The caste war of Yucatan, which began in 1847 and continued sporadically for over 50 years, was the largest Maya uprising since the conquest and demonstrated the enduring strength of Maya identity and political organization. The caste war began as a response to increasing pressure from Mexican authorities who were attempting to integrate Maya communities more fully into the national economy and political system. Maya leaders organized a coordinated rebellion that succeeded in capturing most of the Yucatan Peninsula and establishing an independent Maya state that maintained its autonomy for decades. The rebels were led by Maya intellectuals who had learned to read and write in Spanish, but who used their education to defend Maya rights and interests. They issued proclamations in both Maya languages and Spanish, arguing that Maya people had the right to govern themselves according to their traditional laws and customs. They established a capital city at Chan Santa Cruz, where they maintained Maya religious ceremonies and political institutions, while also dealing diplomatically with the Mexican government and foreign powers. The caste war demonstrated that Maya civilization had not only survived the colonial period, but had also developed new forms of political organization and cultural expression that were well adapted to the modern world. Maya communities had learned to use European technologies, legal systems, and political concepts while maintaining their essential cultural identity. This pattern of adaptation and resistance would continue throughout the modern period as Maya communities confronted the challenges of national integration, economic development, and cultural modernization. The construction of railroads, highways, and telegraph lines brought Maya regions into closer contact with national and international markets, creating new opportunities for economic advancement, but also new threats to cultural autonomy. Maya communities responded to these challenges in various ways. Some embraced economic modernization, learning new skills and adopting new technologies while maintaining their cultural identity. Maya farmers began growing cash crops for export markets. Maya artisans learned to produce goods for tourist consumption, and Maya intellectuals began writing literature and scholarly works that brought Maya perspectives to national and international audiences. Other Maya communities chose to maintain greater isolation from the outside world, preserving traditional ways of life in remote areas where government control remained weak. These communities continued to practice traditional agriculture, maintain Maya religious ceremonies, and govern themselves according to customary law. They often developed sophisticated strategies for dealing with outside authorities while maintaining their internal autonomy. The 20th century brought new challenges and opportunities for Maya communities. The Mexican Revolution of 1910-1920 created possibilities for greater political participation and cultural recognition, though these opportunities were not always realized in practice. Educational programs brought literacy to many Maya communities, but often at the cost of suppressing Maya languages and cultural practices. The development of archaeological research in the Maya region during the 20th century had complex effects on Maya communities. On one hand, archaeological discoveries brought international attention to Maya achievements and helped to counter racist stereotypes that portrayed Maya people as backward or inferior. The decipherment of Maya hieroglyphic writing in the 1960s and 1970s revealed the sophistication of pre-Columbian Maya civilization and provided new sources of pride for contemporary Maya communities. On the other hand, archaeological research was often conducted without the participation or consent of Maya communities, and the benefits of tourism development were not always shared equitably with local populations. Maya communities found themselves in the paradoxical position of being celebrated for their ancestors' achievements while being marginalized in contemporary society. These tensions came to a head during the 1970s and 1980s, when many Maya communities in Guatemala became involved in civil war. The conflict, which lasted from 1960 to 1996, was particularly devastating for Maya populations, who suffered disproportionately from government repression and military violence. Entire Maya villages were destroyed, and hundreds of thousands of Maya people were killed or forced to flee their homes. But the Civil War also catalyzed new forms of Maya political organization and cultural activism. Maya intellectuals and political leaders began to articulate demands for cultural rights, political autonomy, and economic justice that drew on both traditional Maya values and modern concepts of human rights and indigenous rights. They established organizations that worked to preserve Maya languages, promote Maya education, and defend Maya land rights. The peace agreements that ended the Guatemalan Civil War in 1996 included unprecedented recognition of Maya rights and culture. The Guatemalan government agreed to recognize Guatemala as a multilingual, multi-ethnic, and multicultural nation, and to take steps to promote Maya languages, education, and cultural practices. Similar developments occurred in other countries with significant Maya populations, as international movements for indigenous rights created new opportunities for Maya political participation. The late 20th and early 21st centuries have seen a remarkable renaissance of Maya culture and identity. Maya languages, which had been suppressed for centuries, are now being taught in schools and universities. Maya artists, writers, and filmmakers are creating new works that combine traditional themes with contemporary forms of expression. Maya scholars are conducting research on their own history and culture, often challenging interpretations that had been developed by outside researchers. Maya communities have also become increasingly active in environmental and human rights movements, drawing on traditional concepts of the relationship between humans and nature to address contemporary challenges like climate change, deforestation, and water scarcity. Maya agricultural knowledge, preserved through centuries of cultural continuity, is being recognized as valuable for developing sustainable farming practices. At the same time, Maya communities continue to face significant challenges. Poverty, discrimination, and political marginalization remain serious problems in many areas. Globalization and economic development create pressures for cultural assimilation and environmental degradation. Climate change threatens traditional agricultural practices and water resources that have sustained Maya communities for millennia. But the story of Maya civilization over the past 5 centuries demonstrates remarkable resilience and adaptability. Maya communities have shown that it is possible to maintain cultural identity and values while adapting to changing circumstances. They have preserved essential aspects of their heritage while also embracing beneficial innovations from the outside world. Today, there are approximately 7 million Maya people living in Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, Honduras, and El Salvador, making them one of the largest indigenous populations in the Americas. They speak over 30 different Maya languages, maintain thousands of communities ranging from isolated villages to urban neighborhoods, and participate in every aspect of modern life while maintaining their distinctive cultural identity. Maya intellectuals have become prominent figures in literature, politics, and scholarship. Rigoberta Menchú, a Quiché Maya woman from Guatemala, won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1992 for her work promoting indigenous rights and social justice. Maya writers like Gaspar Pedro González and Humberto Acabal have gained international recognition for their literary works that draw on traditional Maya themes and worldviews. Maya communities have also become leaders in the movement for indigenous rights throughout the Americas. They have developed sophisticated legal and political strategies for protecting their lands, languages, and cultural practices. They have created educational institutions that combine traditional Maya knowledge with modern academic disciplines. They have established businesses and cooperatives that provide economic opportunities while maintaining cultural values. Perhaps most remarkably, Maya communities have maintained the calendar systems and astronomical knowledge that have been central to their civilization for over 3 millennia. Maya priests and daykeepers continue to track the sacred count of days, to calculate the optimal times for ceremonies and agricultural activities, and to maintain the spiritual practices that connect contemporary Maya people with their ancestors and their land. The Maya calendar became the subject of widespread international attention in 2012, when some people misinterpreted Maya prophecies as predicting the end of the world. Maya intellectuals responded by explaining that their calendar system actually predicted not the end of the world, but the beginning of a new cycle, a time of renewal and transformation. This misunderstanding provided an opportunity for Maya people to educate the world about their actual beliefs and practices, demonstrating once again their ability to use outside attention to promote their own interests and perspectives. The final saga of Maya civilization is not one of decline or disappearance, but of continuity and transformation. The Maya have survived conquest, colonization, and modernization while maintaining their essential identity. They have adapted to changing circumstances while preserving the knowledge, values, and practices that connect them to their ancestors and their land. Today's Maya face the same challenges that confront indigenous peoples throughout the world. How to maintain cultural identity in an increasingly globalized world. How to balance tradition with innovation. How to preserve their languages and knowledge systems while participating fully in modern society. But the history of Maya civilization over the past 2 millennia suggests that these challenges, while serious, are not insurmountable. The Maya have always been a people of time, carefully tracking the cycles of days, months, and years that govern human life and cosmic order. Their understanding of time is not linear but cyclical, with past, present, and future interconnected in complex patterns of repetition and renewal. From this perspective, the current challenges facing Maya communities are part of a larger cycle that will eventually lead to new forms of growth and development. The ancient Maya scribe who sat by his pine torch over 13 centuries ago, carefully recording the movements of Venus across the night sky, could not have imagined the world his descendants would inhabit today. But he would recognize in contemporary Maya communities the same devotion to precise observation, the same respect for traditional knowledge, and the same commitment to maintaining the sacred count of days that has continued unbroken since the world began. In the patient work of today's Maya intellectuals, artists, and community leaders, he would see the continuation of a tradition that has already survived for over 4,000 years and shows every sign of continuing for thousands more. The story of Maya civilization is ultimately a story about the power of human communities to adapt, survive, and flourish across vast spans of time. It is a story about the importance of maintaining connections to the past while embracing the possibilities of the future. It is a story about the resilience of human culture and the enduring strength of human communities bound together by shared values, shared knowledge, and shared commitment to the continuation of life itself. As the contemporary Maya continue their ancient count of days, recording the passage of time with the same precision their ancestors used to track the movements of celestial bodies, they carry forward not just the memory of one of humanity's greatest civilizations, but the living reality of its continued existence. But to truly understand the depth of this continuity, we must delve deeper into the ways Maya knowledge has persisted and evolved, the individual lives that have carried these traditions forward, and the profound insights Maya civilization offers to our modern world. In the highland village of Chichicastenango, Guatemala, an elderly Quiche Maya daykeeper named Alejandro Cirilo Perez rises before dawn each morning to greet the sun with prayers that his ancestors have offered for countless generations. His weathered hands hold bundles of copal incense and colored candles as he makes his way to one of the many sacred sites that dot the mountains surrounding his community. The prayers he whispers are in Quiche, one of the 30 Maya languages still spoken today, and they follow formulas that connect him directly to the priests who once climbed the pyramids of Tikal and Palenque. Alejandro learned his role as a daykeeper not from books or formal schools, but through years of apprenticeship with elders who had themselves learned from their predecessors in an unbroken chain stretching back through centuries. He can calculate complex calendar correlations in his head, determining the significance of any given day according to multiple interlocking cycles that govern everything from personal destiny to agricultural timing. When couples come to him seeking advice about marriage dates, when farmers ask about planting schedules, when families need to understand the spiritual significance of a child's birth date, Alejandro consults the same calendar system that guided Maya kings and queens over 1,000 years ago. This preservation of traditional knowledge through living practice rather than written records represents one of the most remarkable aspects of Maya cultural continuity. While the Spanish colonial authorities destroyed thousands of Maya books and suppressed public ceremonies, they could not eliminate the knowledge held in human memory and passed down through family lines and apprenticeship relationships. Maya communities developed sophisticated strategies for preserving their intellectual heritage while appearing to comply with colonial religious requirements. In many Maya households, traditional ceremonies continued to be performed in secret, often in the early hours before dawn, or in remote locations away from Spanish oversight. Children learned traditional prayers and calendar calculations by listening to their grandparents, absorbing complex mathematical and astronomical concepts through repetition and practice rather than formal instruction. Women often played crucial roles in this cultural transmission, teaching traditional weaving patterns that encoded astronomical information, preparing foods for ceremonies according to ancient recipes, and maintaining household shrines where traditional deities were worshipped alongside Catholic saints. The strength of these informal educational systems becomes clear when we examine specific examples of knowledge preservation. The traditional Maya technique for producing indigo dye, which creates the brilliant blue color that appears in Maya textiles throughout their history, was maintained by women weavers who passed the complex process from mother to daughter across centuries of cultural disruption. The technique involves the careful cultivation of specific plants, the timing of harvests according to lunar cycles, and fermentation processes that require precise temperature and pH control. This knowledge, which represents sophisticated understanding of chemistry and plant biology, was preserved entirely through oral tradition and hands-on practice. Similarly, Maya agricultural knowledge survived colonial and modern periods through the continued practice of traditional farming techniques. Maya farmers in the highlands of Guatemala still use terracing and crop rotation systems that were developed over 2 millennia ago, combining ancient wisdom with innovations developed to address contemporary challenges. They maintain detailed knowledge of plant genetics, having developed hundreds of varieties of corn, beans, and squash that are perfectly adapted to specific microclimates and soil conditions. The village of Santiago Atitlan, situated on the shores of Lake Atitlan in Guatemala, provides a particularly striking example of cultural continuity in the face of modern pressures. The Tz'utujil Maya community of Santiago Atitlan has maintained its traditional religious practices despite centuries of persecution and, more recently, decades of civil war that brought violence directly to their doorstep. The community's religious leaders continue to perform elaborate ceremonies in honor of Maximon, a syncretic deity who combines aspects of traditional Maya gods with elements borrowed from Catholic and even ancient Mayan traditions. Maximon is not simply a museum piece or tourist attraction, but a living religious tradition that provides real spiritual guidance to community members. His shrine moves from house to house throughout the year, and the families who host him take on significant responsibilities for maintaining the rituals and offerings that sustain his power. The ceremonies performed in his honor involve the burning of specific types of incense, the offering of particular foods and drinks, and the recitation of prayers that combine Spanish and Tz'utujil languages in ways that would have been impossible before the colonial period, but that now represent authentic traditions for the people who practice them. The story of how Santiago Atitlan's religious traditions survived the violence of Guatemala's civil war illustrates the remarkable resilience of Maya culture. During the 1980s, when Guatemala's military government was conducting what United Nations investigators later determined to be genocidal attacks against Maya communities, the people of Santiago Atitlan found ways to maintain their religious practices even when public ceremonies became too dangerous to perform. Community leaders developed networks for secretly transporting Maximon and his ritual objects to safe locations when military operations threatened the village. They modified traditional ceremonies to make them less visible to outside observers, performing abbreviated versions in private homes rather than the full public rituals that had been traditional. Young people who might normally have learned ceremonial roles through gradual participation were given accelerated training so that essential knowledge would not be lost if community elders were killed or disappeared. These wartime adaptations required considerable creativity and courage, but they were successful in preserving traditions that might otherwise have been lost forever. When peace returned to Guatemala in the 1990s, the community was able to restore its traditional ceremonies and begin teaching younger generations the full complexity of their religious heritage. The experience had taught them valuable lessons about the importance of documentation and the need to develop multiple strategies for cultural preservation. Similar stories of cultural resilience can be found throughout the Maya world. In the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico, Maya communities maintained their traditional beekeeping practices throughout the colonial and modern periods, preserving detailed knowledge of the behavior and management of native stingless bees. These bees produce honey that has been considered sacred by Maya peoples for over 2 millennia, and the honey plays important roles in religious ceremonies and traditional medicine. Maya beekeepers developed sophisticated techniques for managing bee colonies without destroying them, creating sustainable honey production systems that modern entomologists now recognize as models of ecological farming. They learned to read subtle changes in bee behavior that indicate environmental conditions, to time honey harvests according to floral cycles, and to use honey and beeswax for medicinal purposes that scientific research has now validated as effective treatments for various ailments. The preservation of traditional beekeeping knowledge required communities to maintain not just technical skills, but also the religious beliefs and ceremonial practices associated with bee management. Maya beekeepers believed that bees are messengers between the human world and the realm of the gods, and they perform specific rituals before opening hives, during honey harvests, and when establishing new colonies. These religious practices, which might appear to outside observers as merely superstition, actually encode sophisticated understanding of bee psychology and colony management that helps ensure the health and productivity of the hives. In recent decades, Maya beekeeping communities have faced new challenges from industrial agriculture, pesticide use, and the introduction of African honeybees that compete with native species. But they have responded to these challenges by adapting their traditional knowledge to contemporary circumstances, working with environmental organizations to document their practices, and advocating for policies that protect native bee populations and traditional land use rights. The revival of Maya textile traditions provides another compelling example of cultural continuity and adaptation. Maya women have maintained weaving techniques and design traditions for over 2 millennia, creating textiles that serve not just as clothing, but as expressions of cultural identity, religious belief, and community membership. Each Maya community has its own distinctive patterns and color combinations, and experienced weavers can often identify a person's village of origin simply by examining their clothing. During the colonial period, Spanish authorities attempted to suppress Maya textile traditions by requiring indigenous people to wear European-style clothing and by restricting access to traditional materials and dyes. But Maya women found ways to preserve their weaving knowledge by incorporating required elements while maintaining traditional techniques and symbolic systems. They learned to use imported materials while preserving indigenous design principles, and they developed new patterns that appeared to comply with colonial requirements, while actually encoding traditional religious and astronomical information. The 20th century brought new challenges to Maya textile traditions as mass-produced clothing became cheaper and more widely available. Many Maya communities began to abandon traditional dress for practical economic reasons, and it seemed that centuries-old weaving traditions might disappear within a generation. But the 1980s and 1990s saw a remarkable revival of interest in Maya textiles, driven partly by external demand from tourists and collectors, but also by internal movements for cultural preservation and pride. Maya women's cooperatives began organizing to preserve traditional techniques, while also developing new markets for their products. They established training programs to teach young women traditional weaving methods, created documentation projects to record the meanings of traditional patterns, and developed quality standards that distinguished authentic hand-woven textiles from machine-made imitations. One of the most successful of these initiatives was established by the women of Comalapa, a Cachiquel Maya community in Guatemala. In the 1980s, facing economic hardship and the disruption of civil war, a group of women in Comalapa organized a weaving cooperative that combined traditional techniques with innovative designs and marketing strategies. They began creating textiles that maintained traditional technical excellence while incorporating new patterns and color combinations that appealed to contemporary tastes. The Comalapa Cooperative became a model for similar organizations throughout the Maya world, demonstrating that traditional crafts could provide sustainable economic opportunities while preserving cultural heritage. The women involved in these cooperatives became not just skilled artisans, but also community leaders, using their economic success to advocate for education, healthcare, and political representation in their communities. These textile cooperatives also became important sites for cultural transmission, where older women taught traditional techniques to younger generations, while also encouraging innovation and experimentation. Young weavers learned not just how to create traditional patterns, but also the stories and beliefs associated with different designs, the astronomical and agricultural significance of various symbols, and the social protocols that govern when and how different textiles should be worn. The success of Maya textile cooperatives attracted attention from development organizations and government agencies, leading to programs designed to support traditional crafts as sources of income for indigenous communities. But Maya weavers quickly learned that external support often came with strings attached, as donors and government officials promoted their own ideas about what traditional crafts should look like and how they should be marketed. Maya communities responded to these challenges by developing their own standards for authenticity and quality, creating certification systems that distinguished genuine traditional crafts from commercial imitations. They established training programs that taught business skills alongside traditional techniques, ensuring that Maya artisans could participate in global markets while maintaining control over their cultural heritage. The story of how Maya communities have preserved and revitalized their textile traditions illustrates broader patterns in contemporary Maya cultural movements. Rather than simply maintaining ancient practices unchanged, Maya communities have shown remarkable creativity in adapting traditional knowledge to contemporary circumstances. They have learned to use modern technologies and global markets to support traditional ways of life, and they have developed new institutions that can preserve cultural heritage while also promoting economic development and political empowerment. Similar patterns can be seen in Maya efforts to preserve and promote their languages. Maya languages faced severe pressure during the colonial period and the early decades of the modern era, as government schools, religious institutions, and employers all promoted Spanish fluency while discouraging or actively suppressing Maya language use. By the 1960s, linguists were predicting that most Maya languages would disappear within a generation or two as younger people abandoned them in favor of Spanish. But the 1970s and 1980s saw the emergence of Maya intellectual movements that challenged these predictions and began working actively to preserve and promote Maya languages. Maya linguists, many of whom had learned to read and write first in Spanish, began developing writing systems for their own languages and creating educational materials that could be used in community schools. The development of Maya literacy was not simply a technical exercise, but a deeply political one, as Maya intellectuals argued that their languages were not primitive dialects, but sophisticated communication systems with their own grammatical rules, literary traditions, and philosophical concepts. They began publishing newspapers, books, and magazines in Maya languages, demonstrating that these languages could handle contemporary topics as effectively as any European language. One of the pioneers in this movement was Adrian Inés Chávez, a Quiché Maya linguist who spent decades developing a standardized writing system for his language and creating educational materials that could be used in Maya schools. Chávez argued that Maya languages preserved unique ways of understanding the world that could not be fully translated into Spanish or any other language, and that the loss of Maya languages would therefore represent a loss for all of humanity. Chávez and other Maya linguists faced considerable opposition from government officials and even some members of their own communities who believed that promoting Maya languages would hold back educational and economic progress. But they persisted in their work, establishing schools that taught literacy in Maya languages, training teachers who could work in bilingual classrooms, and creating university programs that offered instruction in Maya languages and literatures. By the 1990s, these efforts began to show significant results. Guatemala's peace accords included provisions for promoting Maya language education. and the country's constitution was amended to recognize Maya languages as national languages alongside Spanish. Similar developments occurred in Mexico, where the state of Yucatan began offering instruction in Maya languages in public schools and universities. These legal and institutional changes were important, but the real success of Maya language preservation efforts came at the community level, where families and local organizations began making deliberate decisions to raise children as speakers of Maya languages. Parents who had been educated exclusively in Spanish began learning to read and write in their ancestral languages so that they could teach their children. Community leaders organized cultural events that celebrated Maya languages and encouraged their use in public settings. The results of these efforts are now visible throughout the Maya world. Children who might have grown up speaking only Spanish are now bilingual in Spanish and their community's Maya language. University students are writing theses in Quichua, Yucatec, and other Maya languages. Radio stations broadcast news and music in Maya languages, and internet websites provide information in languages that some experts had predicted would be extinct by now. The preservation of Maya languages has had impacts far beyond simple communication. Language preservation efforts have become focal points for broader movements for cultural revitalization and political empowerment. Maya communities that have successfully maintained or revived their languages have often been more successful in preserving other aspects of their cultural heritage and in advocating for their rights within national political systems. The connection between language preservation and political empowerment becomes particularly clear when we examine the careers of individual Maya leaders who have used their linguistic and cultural knowledge to become effective advocates for their communities. Rigoberta Menchú, the Quiché Maya woman who won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1992, grew up speaking only Quiché and learned Spanish as a second language when she began working as a domestic servant in Guatemala City. Menchú's experience of discrimination based on her indigenous identity and her inability to speak Spanish fluently motivated her to become involved in organizing efforts among Maya communities. She learned to use her bilingual abilities to serve as a translator and mediator between Maya communities and Spanish-speaking organizations, and she eventually became an international spokesperson for indigenous rights movements throughout the Americas. Menchú's autobiography, published in Spanish as Me llamo Rigoberta Menchú y así me nació la conciencia, became one of the most widely read books about indigenous experiences in Latin America. But equally important were her efforts to promote Quichua language and culture, including her work to establish schools that taught literacy in Quichua, and her advocacy for constitutional recognition of Maya languages in Guatemala. Similar stories can be told about dozens of other Maya leaders who have used their cultural knowledge and linguistic abilities to become effective advocates for their communities. Demetrio Corti Cuxil, a Kaqchikel Maya intellectual from Guatemala, became one of the most influential theorists of Maya nationalism, arguing that Maya peoples constitute distinct nations with rights to self-determination and cultural autonomy. Corti studied linguistics and education at universities in Guatemala and Europe, but he always maintained that his most important education came from his grandmother and other community elders who taught him traditional Kaqchikel knowledge systems. He used his academic training to develop sophisticated arguments for Maya rights that drew on both traditional Maya political concepts and contemporary international law regarding indigenous peoples. Corti's work helped lay the intellectual foundation for the Maya nationalist movement that emerged in Guatemala during the 1980s and 1990s. This movement argued that Maya peoples were not simply ethnic minorities within the Guatemalan nation, but rather distinct peoples with their own political traditions, territorial rights, and cultural institutions. Maya nationalists advocated for constitutional reforms that would recognize Guatemala as a multinational state and establish autonomous regions where Maya communities could govern themselves according to traditional laws and customs. These political arguments were supported by detailed research into Maya history, law, and political organization that demonstrated the sophistication and continuity of Maya political traditions. Maya intellectuals documented the survival of traditional legal systems in Maya communities, showing how these systems had adapted to colonial and modern circumstances while maintaining their essential characteristics. Traditional Maya legal systems are based on principles of consensus building, restorative justice, and community harmony that differ significantly from European-derived legal traditions. Maya communities typically resolve disputes through extended discussions involving community elders, affected parties, and other community members, with the goal of reaching solutions that restore social harmony rather than simply punishing wrongdoers. These legal traditions survived the colonial period and continue to operate alongside or underneath official Spanish and later national legal systems. Maya communities developed sophisticated strategies for managing relationships with outside authorities while maintaining their own internal systems of justice and social control. They learned when to involve outside authorities in dispute resolution and when to handle matters internally according to traditional procedures. The documentation of these legal traditions became important evidence in arguments for constitutional recognition of Maya political rights. Maya intellectuals argued that their communities had never actually ceded sovereignty to Spanish or later national authorities, but had instead maintained their own political institutions while adapting to changing external circumstances. These arguments gained credibility from international developments in indigenous rights law, particularly the adoption of the International Labour Organization's Convention 169 concerning indigenous and tribal peoples, which recognizes indigenous peoples' rights to maintain their own legal systems and political institutions. Guatemala ratified this convention in 1996, creating legal obligations to respect Maya political rights and traditional institutions. The practical implementation of these legal commitments has proven challenging, as Maya communities have had to negotiate complex relationships with national courts, government agencies, and development organizations. But significant progress has been made in establishing the legitimacy of Maya legal systems and creating mechanisms for coordination between traditional and official legal institutions. One of the most successful examples of this coordination can be found in the municipality of San Juan Ostuncalco in Guatemala, where Maya communities have developed formal agreements with national authorities that recognize traditional legal procedures for certain types of disputes. Community members can choose whether to pursue resolution of conflicts through traditional processes overseen by Maya elders or through the official court system, and the decisions reached through traditional processes are legally recognized by national authorities. This system has proven effective at reducing the caseload on official courts, while also providing culturally appropriate dispute resolution mechanisms for Maya community members. It has served as a model for similar arrangements in other parts of Guatemala, and has attracted attention from legal scholars and policy makers interested in developing more inclusive approaches to justice and governance. The success of Maya political movements in achieving constitutional recognition and legal reforms has encouraged similar efforts in other countries with significant Maya populations. In Mexico, Maya communities in Chiapas, Yucatan, and other states have organized to demand greater political autonomy and recognition of their traditional institutions. The Zapatista movement in Chiapas, while not exclusively Maya, has drawn heavily on Maya political traditions and has succeeded in establishing autonomous municipalities where indigenous communities govern themselves according to traditional customs. These political developments have been accompanied by remarkable achievements in Maya education and scholarship. Maya universities, such as the Universidad Intercultural Maya de Quintana Roo in Mexico and the Universidad Maya in Guatemala, now offer degree programs taught in Maya languages and focusing on Maya knowledge systems. These institutions represent the culmination of decades of effort to create educational opportunities that serve Maya communities while respecting their cultural values and intellectual traditions. Maya scholars trained at these institutions are conducting research that challenges long-held assumptions about Maya history and culture. They are reinterpreting archaeological evidence from Maya perspectives, documenting traditional knowledge systems that had been dismissed as superstition, and developing new theoretical frameworks for understanding indigenous experiences and worldviews. One area where Maya scholarship has had particular impact is in the field of environmental science. Traditional Maya ecological knowledge, preserved through centuries of practical application in agriculture, forestry, and natural resource management, is now being recognized as valuable for addressing contemporary environmental challenges such as climate change, biodiversity loss, and sustainable development. Maya communities in Belize, for example, have been recognized as effective guardians of tropical forest ecosystems, maintaining forest cover and biodiversity in areas under their management, while communities in adjacent areas have experienced significant deforestation. Their success is based on traditional knowledge systems that understand forests not as collections of individual trees, but as complex ecological communities with intricate relationships between plants, animals, soils, and water systems. Maya forest management techniques include sophisticated understanding of plant succession, soil chemistry, and wildlife behavior that allows communities to harvest forest products sustainably while maintaining ecosystem health. They practice forms of agroforestry that integrate food production with forest conservation, creating productive landscapes that provide both human livelihoods and habitat for native species. This traditional ecological knowledge is now being studied by environmental scientists who recognize that indigenous knowledge systems often contain insights that are not captured by conventional scientific methods. Collaborations between Maya communities and research institutions are producing new approaches to conservation and resource management that combine traditional knowledge with contemporary scientific techniques. These collaborations have also led to important innovations in climate change adaptation strategies. Maya communities have thousands of years of experience adapting to climate variability in tropical environments, and their traditional agricultural techniques include methods for dealing with droughts, floods, and other extreme weather events that are becoming more frequent due to climate change. Maya farmers maintain dozens of varieties of corn, beans, and other crops that are adapted to different environmental conditions, providing genetic diversity that allows agricultural systems to respond to changing conditions. They practice crop rotation and intercropping techniques that maintain soil fertility while reducing vulnerability to pests and diseases. They have developed water management systems that can capture and store rainwater during wet periods for use during droughts. These traditional techniques are being studied and adapted for use in other regions facing similar climate challenges. International development organizations are working with Maya communities to document their traditional knowledge and develop training programs that can share these techniques with farmers in other parts of the world. The recognition of Maya environmental knowledge has also led to new forms of economic development that provide income for Maya communities while supporting conservation goals. Ecotourism programs allow visitors to learn about traditional Maya knowledge while generating revenue for community development. Sustainable forestry and agriculture projects market products based on traditional techniques to consumers who value environmentally responsible production methods. These economic opportunities have created new incentives for young Maya people to learn traditional knowledge systems that their parents might have considered obsolete. Young people who might have migrated to cities in search of economic opportunities are now finding that traditional knowledge can provide the foundation for sustainable livelihoods in their home communities. The revival of interest in traditional knowledge has also supported the development of new forms of Maya artistic expression. Contemporary Maya artists are drawing on traditional themes and techniques while also experimenting with new media and artistic forms. Maya painters, sculptors, musicians, and writers are creating works that speak to both Maya and international audiences, building bridges between traditional culture and contemporary artistic movements. The work of artists like Miguel Ángel Asturias, a Guatemalan writer of Maya descent who won the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1967, helped introduce Maya literary traditions to international audiences. Asturias drew on Maya mythology and worldviews in novels and poems that combine traditional themes with modernist literary techniques, creating works that were both distinctively Guatemalan and universally accessible. More recent Maya artists have continued this tradition while also developing distinctively contemporary forms of expression. Painters like Benvenuto Chavajay and Luis González Palma have created visual art that combines traditional Maya symbols and themes with contemporary techniques and materials. Musicians like Sara Karusic and Emi Mena perform songs in Maya languages that address contemporary social and political issues while drawing on traditional musical forms. Maya filmmakers have begun using cinema to document traditional knowledge and tell stories from Maya perspectives. Films like Ixcanul, 2015, by Jairo Bustamante, which was shot in Kaqchikel language, have gained international recognition while telling distinctively Maya stories that challenge stereotypes and misconceptions about indigenous peoples. These artistic achievements have helped change international perceptions of Maya culture, moving beyond romantic stereotypes about ancient civilizations to recognize Maya peoples as contemporary communities with vibrant cultural traditions and important contributions to make to global society. They have also provided new sources of pride and inspiration for Maya communities, demonstrating that traditional culture can serve as the foundation for contemporary creativity and success. The transformation of international perceptions about Maya culture has been particularly important in the field of tourism, which has become a major source of income for many Maya communities, but has also created challenges for cultural preservation. Tourist interest in Maya culture creates economic opportunities for communities near archaeological sites, but it can also lead to the commodification of cultural practices and the creation of artificial or simplified versions of traditional customs designed to appeal to foreign visitors. Maya communities have responded to these challenges by developing forms of cultural tourism that they control and that serve their own interests and values. Community-based tourism initiatives allow visitors to learn about Maya culture from Maya people themselves, rather than from outside tour guides who may lack deep knowledge of Maya traditions. These programs provide income for local families, while also creating incentives for cultural preservation and transmission. One successful example of community-controlled cultural tourism can be found in the village of San Juan La Laguna, on Lake Atitlan in Guatemala. This Tzutujil Maya community has developed a tourism program that allows visitors to learn about traditional weaving, natural dyeing, and medicinal plant use, while participating in activities that support local families and preserve traditional knowledge. Visitors stay in locally owned accommodations, eat meals prepared by community members, and participate in workshops taught by local experts in traditional crafts and knowledge systems. The success of this program has inspired similar initiatives in other Maya communities, creating networks of cultural tourism destinations that offer authentic experiences while supporting community development and cultural preservation. These programs have also become models for sustainable tourism development in other indigenous communities throughout the Americas. The development of cultural tourism has created new roles for Maya people as cultural interpreters and educators, requiring them to articulate their traditions and worldviews for outside audiences. This process has sometimes led to new insights into their own culture, as community members work to explain complex concepts and practices to visitors who lack cultural background knowledge. Maya tour guides and cultural interpreters have become important figures in cultural preservation efforts, as they develop skills in translating between different cultural systems and worldviews. They learn to present traditional knowledge in ways that are accessible to outsiders, while maintaining the integrity and complexity of Maya cultural concepts. These interpretation skills have also proven valuable in other contexts, as Maya communities increasingly find themselves needing to explain their traditions and rites to government officials, development workers, researchers, and other outsiders. Maya people with experience in cultural interpretation have often become effective advocates and negotiators in these interactions. The role of Maya women in cultural preservation and development initiatives has been particularly important, as women have traditionally been the primary keepers of many aspects of Maya cultural knowledge. Women maintain textile traditions, prepare traditional foods, organize household religious practices, and often serve as informal teachers for children and young people learning traditional knowledge. Maya women's organizations have become important forces for cultural preservation and political empowerment, combining traditional roles with contemporary advocacy strategies. Organizations like the National Coordination of Guatemalan Widows, CONAVIGA, have fought for justice for victims of violence, while also working to preserve traditional knowledge and promote women's rights. Maya women have also become prominent in environmental protection movements, drawing on traditional roles as caretakers of household resources and traditional knowledge about plant and animal behavior. Women's organizations have organized to protect water sources, oppose mining projects that threaten traditional territories, and promote sustainable agricultural practices based on traditional knowledge. The leadership of Maya women in these movements reflects traditional Maya values that recognize women's authority in certain spheres, while also adapting to contemporary circumstances that require new forms of political organization and advocacy. Maya women have learned to use international human rights frameworks and environmental protection laws to defend traditional territories and cultural practices. These advocacy efforts have achieved significant successes, including legal victories that have protected Maya territories from mining and development projects, constitutional reforms that recognize women's rights and indigenous rights, and international recognition for Maya contributions to environmental protection and sustainable development. The success of Maya advocacy movements has also contributed to broader international movements for indigenous rights and environmental protection. Maya leaders have become prominent figures in international forums, sharing their experiences and knowledge with indigenous peoples from other parts of the world and contributing to the development of international laws and policies that protect indigenous rights. The influence of Maya movements can be seen in international agreements like the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which was adopted in 2007 after decades of advocacy by indigenous leaders from around the world, including many prominent Maya activists. This declaration recognizes indigenous peoples' rights to maintain their cultural traditions, govern their territories according to traditional laws, and participate as equals in national and international political processes. As we look toward the future, the story of Maya civilization offers important lessons about cultural resilience, adaptation, and the possibilities for maintaining traditional values while engaging with modern challenges. The Maya have demonstrated that it is possible for indigenous communities to preserve their essential cultural identity while also adapting to changing circumstances and taking advantage of new opportunities. The continuation of Maya civilization into the 21st century represents one of humanity's great success stories in cultural preservation and adaptation. Despite centuries of persecution, marginalization, and attempts at cultural destruction, Maya communities have maintained their languages, their knowledge systems, their artistic traditions, and their spiritual practices, while also achieving significant political recognition and economic development. The future of Maya civilization will undoubtedly bring new challenges and opportunities. Climate change threatens traditional agricultural systems and territorial integrity. Globalization creates pressures for cultural homogenization, while also providing new platforms for cultural expression and political organizing. Technological change offers new tools for cultural preservation and transmission, while also creating new forms of cultural disruption. But the history of Maya civilization over the past 5 millennia suggests that Maya communities will meet these challenges with the same creativity, resilience, and wisdom that has allowed them to survive and flourish through previous periods of transformation. They will continue to adapt their traditional knowledge to contemporary circumstances while maintaining the essential values and practices that define their cultural identity. The ancient scribe who recorded the movements of Venus by torchlight 13 centuries ago could not have imagined the world his descendants would inhabit today, with its computers and satellites, its global communications networks and international law. But he would recognize in contemporary Maya communities the same careful attention to celestial cycles, the same respect for traditional knowledge, and the same commitment to maintaining the sacred count of days that connects all things in their proper relationships. In the patient work of today's Maya daykeepers, teachers, artists, and leaders, that ancient scribe would see the continuation of a tradition that has already endured for over 4,000 years. The Maya calendar continues to turn, marking not the end of their story, but its continuation into a future that, like the movements of the stars themselves, follows ancient patterns while also creating infinite possibilities for renewal and growth. The story of Maya civilization is far from over. Indeed, in many ways, it has only just begun.